I've been searching for a definition of samsara, and I've really not come up with a good one. I've heard you speak of it many times, but maybe you could come up with your definition of samsara, and maybe there's a difference between what you, how you define it, or
Mhm.
how the Buddhist defines it, maybe.
Yeah, sometimes we do make these generalizations and say, in Buddhism, we talk about nirvana, or we talk about non-dualism, or we talk about, samsara, or et cetera, et cetera. And in reality, that is being a little oversimplistic because there's some commonality for sure in various traditions like Buddhism around a particular concept in that tradition, but also there's just disagreements as well. So I'm sure my definition isn't necessarily going to be exactly the same as some other people's, but I think it does carry the spirit that's the same, that there'll be some aspects of it that are pretty similar. And then nuances sometimes. And occasionally you might have somebody who has a really different definition, but there's kind of a gist of it that I think is pretty universal. And so I think, that part of it that's universal is it's a state of consciousness in which there are, one way to talk about it is there's a key factor, which is ignorance. And what we mean by that in this instance is that one is experiencing reality, experiencing oneself, experiencing the world, and our perception of the nature of that which we're experiencing is not accurate. It's not a true understanding. And so that state of consciousness of misperceiving reality is samsara. And then, so what are the implications of that? What are some of the symptoms that come with that? Well, one of the basic truths that we're misperceiving is we're thinking that we're a separate being, but actually we're radically interrelated with all life. Then people will, debate like, how do we want to phrase that? What enlightenment means. But let's just say, for the sake of, our discussion, it means that we experience a radical sense of wholeness, interconnectedness, unification. So we don't feel separate anymore. And with that removal of the illusion, the misunderstanding of separateness, we just feel very different about ourselves in life, and we see reality much more clearly. And also, because we don't feel separate, we don't feel a sense of lack. We don't have a big hole in our nature that we've created with our own misunderstanding. And so out of that hole comes, oh, I've got to fix this. It's kind of like the same way we talk about trauma in psychology, and then like trauma responses. Well, the ultimate trauma is the illusion of separateness. That's the core trauma in all of samsara. Samsara is trauma, is the illusion, that the misunderstanding of it, and then everything else is a trauma response to that. All our desires and aversions and the experience, the emotions that we have, and the stories that we go through, and the successes and failures and struggles and losses. It's all trauma. It's all trauma response and karmic side effects of the core mistake. So all of that's samsara too. So, but the thing is, there's another world, you might say. This is a mysterious thing, but what is, there's another reality that is the true nature of how things are. And that's something, and that's usually, a lot of mystics would rather not sort of talk about that, partially because it's so whole, it's so transcendental that it's hard to put it into words. So a lot of times people would rather say what it's not than rather what it is. So Buddha leaned in that direction. He was like, well, we'll just say nirvana exists. True perception of reality exists. And then we won't get into trying to like nail down what that is too much, because as soon as we do that, we're going to have problems. Let's just talk about like, how do we end the disease of samsara, which is a state of consciousness. And so that's the basic idea of samsara. One thing that we could add to that that's a little harder sometimes for people to sort of grasp is, even though our imagination of our misunderstandings, in a sense, doesn't seem real, it's just like a mistake. It's kind of like, there's the classic image. How are we doing for time here? Okay, not too bad. There's a classic metaphor, I think it comes from some ancient Hindu source of so a person's walking down the road and they see what they think is a snake. And as they get closer, they realize it's not a snake, it's a stick. And they misperceived it as a snake. And so samsara is the snake. It's actually not just a misunderstanding in your mind. It's something that's co-created by a bunch of people who are misperceiving reality, a bunch of beings, not just humans. And it creates a snake, a misperception of the stick. So the stick still exists under the surface of all of that. But then there's all these layers of misperception. Oh, it's a snake. Oh, I don't like snakes. All reactions and running away and stories of getting away from this. And none of that's happening. None of that's real because it's actually a stick. And yet it is real because everybody's imagining it. And those realms of imagination, of misperceiving things as something that they're not and reacting to that, is also a way to understand what samsara is. It's not just a state of mind. It co-created a lot of what we're experiencing around us. So things like all of that's part of samsara too. So there's like another universe that's not separate from it, because it's still the only thing that's actually real is the stick. The other stuff is stuff that's part of the stick, that's the stick misunderstanding what it is. That's the samsara part. But the awakened true nature of reality of the stickness, that's there too. And so in some ways, and the part of that's very paradoxical is all of the stuff that people are imagining that's false is made out of the same true nature of Buddha nature. So when you awaken, you can not only see the stick, you can see that even all the stuff people are imagining is part of the stick. So even that's Buddha nature as well. So you don't have to go anywhere to get to the Buddha nature. It's just a different point of view of everything that exists, both the reality of things and and the reality that's created out of people's misunderstandings. So there are whole universes that are just kind of mainly built out of misunderstanding. And then varying degrees of mixture of dimensions that are realized dimensions mixing with the confused dimensions. And then there's celestial transcendental dimensions that are where everybody, infinite beings, know the true nature of reality. And since the universe is eternal in nature, there's no end to the number of beings that have awakened throughout reality. So those dimensions are populated with infinite awakened Buddhas and Christ beings. It's just the more you get away from, if you go deep into the rabbit hole of forgetting the true nature of things, it seems like there's not many awakened people and we're all separate and it's dark here and can't get back home. It's not even any farther away than your breath. It's right here. The Buddha nature is right here to be realized. And those infinite beings that are awakened are right here too. It's just, we're way into the labyrinth of not believing that that's true. And so that's why you don't need to go anywhere really to awaken. So that's all part of, a cosmology of that would be my version. And I think it's very coincident with the basic idea of Buddhist and Hindu concepts but especially in Hinduism, there are more schools that vary. So there'd be more variation in Hinduism. I think Buddhism is more or less more consistently in a single vision of it with little variations. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, it really makes sense. I really love the answer. I have two more questions. I don't know how much you can dive into them. The
Sure,
first
go ahead.
question is, so I guess aversions and desires also must be a part of the samsara consciousness. The pursuit of happiness through desires and avoiding things must also be a big part of it. And also, spread are samsara, if you could use that term. I mean, as I understand you, there for instance, universal mind, you said, as you said the last time, that that's not enlightened. That means there must be some samsara in the universal mind as well. So do we have samsara on all 7 planes, actually?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And one of the things that shows that, oh, did you want to say something else first?
Yeah, for instance, including the Buddhic plane, does that also, you can see it from a samsaric consciousness, actually? Is that how it should be understood?
Yeah. Yeah. This this is a great topic. It's a big one though, but one way to understand that is, let's say if you love unity and you exist on the universal planes and you're being there, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're enlightened, because you could be attached to unity and be avoiding. So you have a desire, and that it's a very exalted desire. You're attached to unity, and you have an aversion to incarnation, to deeper. As long as you have that bias, your unity, your actual perception of the true nature of unity is distorted. It's not the true nature of unity, because it should be unified with all dimensions, right? And but your perception of it can still cause you, in your attachment to it, to be able to inhabit that realm and avoid, say, incarnational dimensions. But that's still part of samsara, and all of samsara is temporary. So eventually that karma of that building up that ability to do that, and that attachment will exhaust itself, and eventually you'll go through other kinds of experiences, and it'll keep you on your way, and you'll gain more wisdom. And so, yep, even those dimensions. Now, every dimension is inhabited by beings who are enlightened too. So you can go to the Buddhic plane and encounter enlightened beings there. But the Buddhic plane itself is not inherently necessarily enlightened. But if you go to that dimension and experience the part of you that inhabits that dimension, that part's pretty wise. That part is pretty awake. That part has a lot of wisdom. So you have to distinguish between beings and parts of yourself that are in a dimension. It's the same as the physical plane. There's physical beings that are very enlightened and physical beings who aren't. There's beings in the Buddhic plane that are very enlightened and some that aren't. Something that's very nice about the Buddhic plane, though, is the judgment stops there. There's no longer like breaking up reality into good and evil, or feeling like there's more unity pervading it, but you don't have a lot of wisdom about it. You're just kind of, in fact, some people, if they go there, the physical personality will kind of go to sleep. They won't be able to retain awareness. It'll just be a sort of blissful, groggy state. And so part of what that being needs to do is wake up on the Buddhic plane and not be attached to it, be mindful and wise there. Human beings are pretty advanced in doing that as souls, but their personalities aren't. But human beings' souls that kind of take up their residence more on the Buddhic and higher mind, they're still learning to have a more fundamentally non-dual perception of things. They have a very soulful perception, but not a radically non-dual perception. So having access to those planes hasn't made them perfectly enlightened. They need to continue to grow. Does that make sense?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, sure.
Great.
That makes me wonder about the angels, actually. The part of the angelic kingdom that hasn't been human, not the archangel, but if you could call them ordinary angels, are they also in samsara?
Well, there's a whole, all different kinds. There's many angels that are partially enlightened, like at advanced stages of enlightenment, but haven't perfected it yet. So the depth of their non-dual realization isn't perfected yet. And so they come back to the human kingdom to get that. And then there's sort of intermediate ones that are partially enlightened and partially still more involved in samsara. In other words, an archangel that still needs to come back and kind of finish off their enlightenment can be, 90% enlightened. So they're tainted by samsara, but they're getting towards the end of it. Others might be more tainted by it. So it depends on the kind of class of being that we're talking about. And there's many different classes.
Yeah.
And then there's
Right.
even, to complicate matters, there are many humans that take big breaks from the, more or less big breaks, like for thousands or even longer numbers of years, and go off and sort of do other things. And let's say they got to the second or third initiation. They have some wisdom and enlightenment, but it's not finished. So they're still tainted by samsara. And now they might join an archangelic order and do something else for 1,000,000 years. They're pretty enlightened that they can do that work, but they're not done yet. And they'd have to come back to the human kingdom to finish up, because what the human kingdom allows is for you to be in a physical body that also, that body and consciousness is capable of opening up to all the other planes. And so then you can develop a type of equanimity, for instance, that's equally accepting, neither repelled by or attached to any plane. How could you really develop that ability if you didn't have access to all the planes? You have to practice it. You have to be with all the dimensions, all the elements, all the chakras, all the rays, and develop a balanced, inclusive, holistic presence and equanimity towards all of them. So it's very important to ultimately come back into a physical body of some sort that allows you to do that. That's why archangels are sometimes considered to be limited in how far they can go, as long as they're not willing to come into a physical body.
Okay, great. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
I think there's, maybe there's not time enough now, but I have a feeling that there's some deeper wisdom in understanding aversion and desires and its role in samsara, but maybe that's
absolutely. Yeah, in a sense, I would literally just say very simply, our wisdom about desires and aversions is fundamental to our level of enlightenment and freedom. We just we have to keep looking more and more closely at, what is this desire thing? What is this all about? And its only mastery is having like profound insight into it. And it's, so it's an ongoing journey. We don't just look at the light side, we look at the shadow side. We want to know nirvana or God consciousness or enlightenment is also to be thoroughly familiar with samsara and see right into the core of like, what is going on here? What's causing all of this? So yeah, that's part of why we become human, is it gives us that opportunity to have that less, examine all that very closely. And so there's we could certainly continue to talk about. And then, the next question, one of the themes I've talked about that we'll get to, and is going a little bit more into the kinds of enlightened beings and the different terms that people use, like what is the difference between an arhat or a siddhi or a sufi or a bodhisattva or a mahatma, or there's different terminology. Are there stages? Are these, how do these beings come into the world when they're on the path of world service? How do they show up? And one of them is a very interesting question of like, what causes them to even, is compassion a desire? Is that taint you with samsara? Is there a type of compassion that's not tainted by samsara? And, there's wonderful and profound questions there.